In terms of the people on the call today, actually, before we dive into the detail, for those who don't know me, my name's Kevin Pilley. I'm part of the Island Plan Review team. On the call with me today, I've got a couple of my colleagues, Alistair Coates and Natasha Day, who will be trying to deal with any questions either through the chat or as part of any discussion. Also got other colleagues from government involved in the call today who've been doing work on other aspects of the island's economy. So Ian Clarkson and John Votier are also on the call today. So if there are other issues that are raised that are perhaps non-island plan related that they may be able to deal with, they're also on the call. So without further ado, I'll kick off. We want to cover a few issues with you today. We'll provide a brief overview of the consultation process and where we are in terms of the Island Plan Review. We'll talk a little bit about the structure of the draft plan, and then we'll get into the detail around the economy, or those parts of the plan that touch on the economy. We've divided that up into two sections. Initially, we'll talk about retail, office, tourism and light industry section of the plan, and the section related to rural economy. So we've tried to chunk it up. It is quite a large section of the plan, but hopefully that keeps it manageable. And as I say, we'll break at key points to deal with any questions. So that's the format for the session today. And I'll just kick off with talking a little bit about the consultation. So, as you'll know, the draft plan was published on the 19th of April. We're live for a consultation period which lasts for 12 weeks. The consultation period under this new bridging plan process is live for both members of the public and also for states members. So states members have an initial opportunity to lodge amendment during this 12-week consultation period. We would encourage people to engage with the consultation process through the consultation portal. We will accept representations through other means, but we would encourage people to use the consultation portal. The plan is presented in sections on the portal, so you can find the key section of the plan and any key policies or issues that you want to address, and leave comment on them through the portal. And by doing that, you're making a formal representation in relation to into the draft plan. So we would encourage you to use that facility. In terms of where we are with the Island Plan Review timescale, as I say, we're out to consultation, 3-month consultation process. That provides everybody with an opportunity to make comment in relation to the draft plan. Once that consultation period closes on the 12th of July, the Minister will then seek to deal with those representations and publish his initial response to those. Those responses will be considered in terms of the planning inspectors, who are then appointed to deal with the examination in public. So planning inspectors will consider the draft plan, they will consider all of the representations made, and they will seek to hone in on those key issues and challenges related to the draft plan for a more detailed interrogation of those at the examination in public. We envisage that taking place probably sometime in October of this year. Once the inspectors have finalised the outcome of the examination, they will then go away and prepare a report. That will be issued to the Minister at the end of the year. Beginning of next year, the Minister will publish that report, and there's then a further window for both States members' amendments and the Minister to consider making amendments before a States debate in March 2022. The ability of the Minister and the States members to make amendments will be limited to those issues raised by the by the planning inspector in his report. So that's just a quick overview of the timeline in terms of where we are. In terms of the consultation process, obviously the plan's been out for a couple of weeks. We are throughout May and June undertaking a proactive consultation process that will involve these webinars, and there's a number of these over the coming weeks. They tend to be scheduled for a Monday and a Wednesday, and they are themed. And then they'll be supported by, as I say, a surgery on the Friday. So if there are detailed issues that you want to discuss, please book a detailed session with one of the Island Plan Review team on the Friday, and we'll give you information about how to do that at the end of the session. In addition to that, throughout May, we'll also be going around the island to all of the parishes, visiting parish halls in person. So there'll be drop-in sessions where members of the public can come and talk to us to find out about the plan. They'll take place throughout the week, generally starting mid-afternoon to early evening, and then we've got a few sessions on Saturday morning, running into lunchtime. So hopefully that provides islanders with an opportunity to make at least one of those sessions. In addition to that, we'll also be looking to arrange a series of detailed sessions with stakeholder groups, and also political engagement throughout that timeline as well. So that's just to give you a bit of a flavour of some of the things that we are looking to undertake as part of the consultation. Of course, members of the Island Plan Review team also remain available for any queries or questions. Either use the email address islandplan@gov.je, and we've also now got an Island Plan burner phone, so the number of which will be available on the website and is also on the JP adverts as well. So plenty of ways to get in touch with us. In terms of the draft plan, just give you a quick overview of the plan before we get into the meat of the session today. What is the plan comprised of? Well, it's the actual written volume of the plan itself, and that's supported by a range of maps. We've got a series of maps. There are two sets of island-wide maps, one of which has got planning zones on, the other one has got flood risk information on, and the same is then repeated for a detailed inset map, which is pretty much focused on St Helier. So that's the form that the plan takes, and to just give you an overview. So it's the island-wide proposals map, island-wide flood risk map, and the same again repeated for town. A number of you will be familiar with the fact we've been undertaking a review of some of the evidence base that supports the plan. This provides just an overview of the work that's been undertaken. Some of that's been published in advance of the draft plan being issued. Some of that was issued with the draft plan. All of this is available on gov.je through the Island Plan page. The only element outstanding at the moment is a sustainability appraisal. That's being undertaken on the draft plan to assess the sustainability of the plan overall, having regard to both economic, environmental and social considerations. That's being finalised at the moment and will be published shortly. The plan is a little different to its the current Island Plan, divided up into 4 volumes. The number of policies in the plan has been reduced slightly. Some of those have been merged. Some of those have been removed as part of the review process. The format for the policies is generally the same. By law, we're required to set out a justification for a policy. So each policy is accompanied by a preamble which provides that justification, policy in a blue box, and also a number of proposals which either indicate the need or aspiration to undertake further works, and they're during the bridging plan period, and they're indicated in a green box. 4 volumes to the plan: introduction, context, and a set of strategic proposals. So they're regarded as sort of key proposals that require a higher priority of work over the bridging plan period, which you might want to take a look at, and we'll touch on some of those today. Volume 2, strategic policy framework for the plan, which is similar to the current plan in terms of structure, but addition of a new section, which we've called places, which sets some of that overarching policy objectives for different places in the island, setting out an overview about the nature, form and extent of different types of development that might occur in different places throughout the island. And again, I'll touch a little bit on that today. And then supported by a whole range of thematic chapters, which naturally will focus on the economy work today. And then finally, in volume 4, a performance and delivery framework, which seeks to set out how we will deliver the plan, or deliver the objectives of the plan, and how we'll monitor and review that. In terms of the this is just another way of saying that. So effectively, this is how the plan will operate in totality. One of the things to be conscious of, and this applies to the current plan, is that the plan should be considered as a whole. Individual policies can't be used in isolation, so it's important to have regard to the whole content and direction of the plan overall. As I say, we'll focus today. Our focus today is around economy, and that's got some resonance in the strategic policies and also the places section of the plan. Yeah, so I'll start first of all around strategic policies before we dive into the detail of the economy sections. Any questions on that brief canter through the overview and the structure of the plan? If you could raise your hand if anyone's got any questions at that stage. Otherwise, I'll just carry on. No, I can't see anything, so I'll carry on. Obviously, the range of evidence base is broad, but of particular relevance to this area of work that we're talking about today is the employment study, which we commissioned from OVARAP to look at the island's employment base and to provide us with some analysis and a series of recommendations about how the plan might respond to that. That was particularly appropriate given the context of the Bridging Island plan. Obviously, this is a different plan in nature compared to previous island plans. This is a short-term island plan. It's got a 3-year plan period rather than a normal 10-year plan period. Part of the reason for that was to ensure that the plan could provide a response to the pandemic and also the impact of Brexit. And clearly it's difficult to take a longer 10-year view of what the outcome of the effects of both of those issues will be on the island, and particularly on the island economy. So the work that ARAP have done to give us that short-term analysis of what might transpire in relation to various aspects of the island's economy is an important piece of evidence base. So if you haven't looked at that before now, I'd encourage you to dip into that. In terms of the work that we're going to cover today, what we've done is looked at a fairly high level all of the policies that sit in the draft plan and sought to give you a flavour as to whether some policies have changed to any great extent from the current island plan, or whether they're new, or whether in essence they remain unchanged. Where we say they're unchanged, they have been reviewed, so there will be some difference around wording and perhaps nuance, but the general thrust of direction will be similar. So just a quick aid memoir. In terms of the strategic policies, some of them are of direct relevance to the economy, and we'll just touch on a couple of those in the presentation. So, first of all, the spatial strategy, and there's a specific strategic policy which deals with the economy. In terms of the spatial strategy, this is slightly different to the current spatial strategy in the island plan. The current island plan simply presents the built-up area as a uniform area. It doesn't make any distinction between the roles of different parts of that built-up area. This island plan seeks to do that and seeks to provide a hierarchy of settlement, if you like, for different parts of the island, and that then has got consequences in terms of the nature and extent of development that might be planned or envisaged in those areas. And I think it's important to particularly recognise that clearly St Helier remains as the primary centre on the island, but Largescale is given explicit recognition as a secondary centre. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the policy implications that arise as a consequence of that. In terms of the economy in general, there is a strategic policy that sets the overarching framework for the more detailed thematic economic policies, and that's set out here at SP6. Essentially seeks to protect, maintain and encourage economic growth in the island, but with that emphasis on small footprint and high value, given the challenges that we face in dealing with economic growth in a small place. There is explicit encouragement for economic activity at Largescale, and we will touch on that together with support for rural activities as well. As I say, there is a difference in this plan compared to the current plan around having explicit recognition and policy provision for the role of different parts of the island. In terms of the economy, that's particularly relevant for town, Largescale, and also the coast and the marine environment. And we'll talk in more detail about those. The other thing I wanted to highlight here as well is there's also a strategic proposal in the plan. This is one of those proposals that we would envisage undertaking work on during the bridging plan period as a priority, and that's to look at developing a West of Island planning framework focusing on Largescale, but also extending up to Jersey Airport, and looking at some of the longer term development opportunities that part of the island might provide, including potential for economic development. So we'll touch a little bit more on that later on in the session. The plan also sets out as a subset what we're calling a plan for town. Sets out a series of strategic concepts for the development of St Helier, and looks to set that out in a way that people can seek to understand what the comprehensive aspirations are for town as a whole. And there are various dimensions to that, some of which have got economic dimensions, and that's particularly around this concept what we've called enlivening town. So seeking to ensure that it maintains that vibrancy as the island's commercial centre. And there are some specific policies that we'll touch on that seek to support that objective. As I said, the places section of the plan provides an overarching framework for the rest of the plan. In terms of town, the policy here supports the continued function of town as the island's primary centre for economic activity, and we will touch on the key elements of that in more detail. I mentioned that Largescale is given an explicit recognition in the plan in terms of its economic activity. Again, that's recognised in the overarching place policy for Largescale, It's also got a spatial manifestation, and we've sought to define an economic centre for Largescale, which is shown here on the slide, essentially running from Waitrose at Red Houses north up to Largescale precinct. So embracing the existing areas of economic activity, but there's a supportive policy regime that seeks to encourage continued growth, investment and change in that area, and we'll touch on the detail of that as we pick up on the sectoral policies and what that means for Largescale. And then last but not least, the rural economy is reflected in the place policy for the countryside, coast and the marine environment. So that was just a quick overview of some of the strategic policies and the places sections of the plan and its relevance to the economy. Any questions or queries in relation to that before I move on to some of the detail? Okay, I can see a couple of questions. Yeah, Moz, if we take you first. Sorry, I can't. I think you might be on mute, Moz.
I'm sorry. Hi, Kevin.
Hi.
Just with I mean, I haven't had a chance to look at the Arab consultation, but from what you said, can you just say, has there been any consideration of one, working from home and how that's kind of affecting the planning, and two, how new economy is?
In terms of working from home, we've got a specific policy on that. So we'll talk about that when we get into the meat of the policy. In terms of new economic development, you know, this is it's a short-term plan, and so its essential focus is to maintain and support existing economy. But if there are new sectors of growth, then the plan would seek to facilitate that. We're conscious that the digital economy in the island is a growing one, and so the plan acknowledges that and seeks to support that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think Steph was next.
Hi, Kevin. Sorry,
Hi,
I can't find my place name to put the video on, so hopefully my voice is enough. Thank you very much for the explanation. Can I just clarify my understanding of the strategic approach to how the plan envisages supporting economic development, and is that very much along the lines of directing economic development to the existing, and well, we haven't got much new built up area, but to the built up area? Would that be a correct assumption?
I think where economic activity, well, generally economic activity is clearly focused to the built up area. Where there's a specific justification for economic activity outside of the built up area, so clearly, you know, agriculture needs to happen in the countryside, and likewise there are some you know, aquaculture and some marine activities are focused in the marine environment. So where there's a specific justification for a location outside of the built-up area, then the plan seeks to accommodate that. But generally, the thrust is that most economic development would take place within the built-up area. Yeah.
And I've got a sub-question, if I may, just quickly. I mean, are you confident that the built-up area provides enough space? Because I you know, take your point that countryside locations, you know, would support agricultural related businesses, but you know, we know that there are lots and lots of non-agricultural related businesses dotted around the island's countryside, which is a product and function of just how the island has developed. So where do they fall into the plan?
Yeah, well, we look at, as we go through the sort of sectors of the economy, we'll pick up on the sort of land and development requirements associated with those. So perhaps that's something we can pick up as we run through the various sectors. Clearly, different sectors have different needs, and the plan sought to respond to that. So perhaps that's something. Well, as we run through, if you've got any other, you know, if your query isn't answered by some of the detail, then perhaps we can return to that at the end.
Great, thank you.
Okay, and I think David was next.
Thanks, Kevin. You've got a new town centre retail core in ER1. Are you going to be going into detail on that later on?
Yep, that's the next subject.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Okay. Okay. I can't see any more. If those of you have raised your hands, if I could ask you to take them down, if you could click the button, that would be helpful, and we'll carry on. Okay. So as I say, we'll now dip into some of the detail, and we'll cover issues such as retail, office, tourism, and light industrial in this section, and pick up on hopefully some of the issues that you've just raised. So we'll start with retail, and perhaps hopefully this will answer some of David's points. We all recognise, I think, that retail subject to challenge not only caused by the pandemic, but also the challenge of online shopping. And Jersey up to now has been relatively fortunate in that our retail cores remained reasonably robust and healthy compared to some other parts of the UK, for example. The plan has sought to respond to those the challenges of things like online shopping and the changing nature of the high street by seeking to condense the retail core of St Helier, as shown on this slide. So essentially seeking to limit the core retail area of the town to what might be regarded as those primary retail frontages. So you can see here this area embraces, sort of starts at Charing Cross, goes up to Le Jongleur at Snow Hill. So King Street and Queen Street are embraced by that, with small extensions to the north, down New Street to the White Company, and then also down to Halkett Place to the embraces the market, the central market. So that is essentially the sort of primary retail frontages of St Helier. They're embraced by this reduced retail core. So what does that mean in terms of planning policy? What it means is that we would seek to ensure that the uses and development in this area is largely limited to retailing. We would allow some wider town centre uses here, but only where there was evidence to suggest that there wasn't a market for retail use of premises in this locality. So the policy direction is similar to the current island plan, but the spatial extent of that has been altered and reduced. That needs to be considered within other changes that we've made to the wider town centre area. So that core retail area sits within a wider town centre area, which has actually been expanded compared to the current plan. So what this is seeking to do is seeking to ensure that St Helier as a whole, comprising both the core retail area and this wider town centre area, are complementary to each other in the sense that they provide economic activity related to not only retailing, but also other sort of leisure, food and beverage, social type activities that you might expect to find in a vibrant town. So this area has been expanded to embrace the parts of the waterfront, expands up to Kensington Place and Cheapside, and then extends all the way through to the east up to Columbury, and then embraces the fort to the south, and I think in the north embraces Bath Street up to the cinema and town park. So it's a broader town centre area. In terms of the policy provision here, we'll talk a little bit more about floor space thresholds, but we would seek to allow all of those town centre uses in this area. So we would seek to protect them where they exist. Any change away from these town centre uses would require some evidence of some sort of market test before we would allow a change of use away from those. We would allow retailing up to 200 square meters floor space. Anything over and above that would be considered subject to demonstrating its potential impact on the core retail area of the town. So there's some significant change there in terms of the retailing, specifically focused on St Helier. I can see I've got some questions, but I'll carry on through, and perhaps we'll finish the retail section, and then I'll pause for questions then, because I think it's important to see retailing as a whole and look at the thresholds across the island. I've talked about us defining an economic centre for Accommodation, and described that earlier. The policy provision here is again to support both the retailing and those town centre uses in this area, really as a way of trying to encourage investment and enhancement of Accommodations's role as a secondary centre. So again, that sort of pure retail together with associated town centre uses would be permitted and encouraged in that area. Outside of those key areas, we've got provision for local retail, which I'll touch on in a moment. But there's also provision in the plan for what we call large scale retail. And we've defined that as something that's over 200 square meters. And any proposal for large scale retail would need to be subject to what we're calling a sequential test. And any application would need to demonstrate that it's applied that sequential test to its as part of its justification for wherever it might be located on the island. So, ideally, this sort of use should be focused in the core retail area of town. Otherwise, it should be focused on the wider town centre of St Helier or the defined area of Largescale. The next layer in the sequence is the built-up area of town. And then we move into the built-up area of other local centres. As part of the assessment of proposals, we would require evidence of a retail impact assessment to look at impact on existing local centres. We are quite well served with retail provision in the island, which is proportionate to the areas that it takes place. So, you'll all be familiar with the provision of some if we look at food retail, for example, we have a concentration of larger food retail at some key centres that's supported by provision of more local food retail provision, which is quite well matched to the island's distribution of settlement sizes. So this policy seeks to support that hierarchy of provision and make sure that retail provision is matched relative to local need. In terms of very small scale retail, up to 100 square meters of retail floor space would be permitted within any parts of the island's built up area to essentially meet local need. In terms of things that fall within those that area of 100, those sort of medium scale, 100 to 200 square meters. If it's outside of the St Helier town centre and outside of the Kennervay centre, but it's within the built-up area, we would require evidence of need. So there'd need to be a test around that. And then outside of the built-up area, so essentially in the countryside, we would subject any proposals for retail there to a number of tests around scale and its relationship to existing economic activity. And then change of use away from retail is subject to tests. I'll carry on. I think just cover this area around daytime and evening economy uses, because I think this is sort of closely associated with some of the town centre uses. So we've got a specific policy in the plan which seeks to provide a policy provision for daytime and evening economy uses, which essentially are cafes and restaurants, and then entertainment venues. They are specifically supported in the town centre, as we discussed earlier on, in St Helier, the defined centre in Kennervay, and then also encouraged in what we're calling the tourist destination areas. So we recognise things like cafes and restaurants support the island's tourism economy, and they're particularly important in the locations that are identified as the tourism development areas. So that includes Goree, specific locations in St Helier, St Aubin, and also St Bellard's Bay. In terms of proposals for new daytime and evening economy uses, we would apply what we call agent of change principles, and that's really to guard against the impact of these operations on the amenity of adjacent neighbouring properties, particularly residential properties, recognising that they can cause issues of noise disturbance and smell. And then lastly, on the retail side of things, we've got specific provision in the plan for meanwhile retail uses. So recognising the fact that voids in retail space are a reality, there's a policy provision here to enable the meanwhile use of those spaces, pending their longer term reuse. And also a proposal to develop some supplementary planning guidance to specifically look at how we manage change to shop fronts. So that was a canter through some of the retail section of the plan. I'll pause there for questions if anyone wants to ask any questions about retail that hasn't been picked up in the chat. I can see Steph and Dave Dodge. Is your hand up from previously, Steph, or is that a hand with a question?
Sorry, Kevin, I thought I had lowered it. I beg your pardon.
Okay,
sorry.
well, if I take David's then, thanks.
There we go.
Thanks.
Thanks, Steph. Kevin, I'm looking at figure E1 and the new core. Mm-hmm. And it has slid south. We include the central market, but we've lost the fish market. We've lost traders in Bath Street, north of the junction with Hillgrove Street. Don Street's still a desert. And I'm wondering about how you've come to these judgments. Through the Northtown master plan we witnessed in the last island plan, there was specifically no mention of the economy. With the Welcome Ann Court residential development, there was data available on car traffic movement, but it was never published. And I'm really curious about the use of the requirement for sequential testing and retail impact assessment. And I'm wondering if you're going to be applying those tests to your own judgment about strategic planning, about what's good and what's not, because there is a theory that we're in a chicken and egg situation with the north of town, and the chicken and egg is how much you're going to impede convenient customer access for the whole island to the north of St Helier, and how much we want to empower it, because I don't see how it all ties together. I'm sure, you know, and begs the question, is the fish market going?
I think in response to that, I mean, clearly the, you know, as I said, the core retail area seeks to, the policy provision in relation to that is to primarily protect that retail core. The wider town centre, however, also enables retail use. So, you know, there's no threat there to existing retail operations, or indeed new retail operations being proposed within that wider town centre area. I think as I sought to set out, the core retail area and the town centre, wider town centre area, should be seen as operating in as a complementary areas to one another to maintain the vitality and viability of St Helier overall. And we do make specific reference to both the central market and to the fish market in the plan, recognising that they do have a unique value and a unique role as part of Jersey's retail offer. So, you know, the plan seeks to support the viability and vitality of both of those operations. So, you know, it is we recognise it is a challenging time for retail in the island, and the plan is seeking to support that. And you know, clearly the plan is out for consultation, and you know, we would value the input of those who are at the sharp end of that process to you know, to contribute to the process. As we said, we would seek to engage also with stakeholders as well as these public sessions. So you know, we'll be looking to talk to people like Jersey Retail Forum and Chamber around these particular issues.
Okay, so we don't have a retail forum any longer, but we do have a wonderful new officer installed in economic development who's going to be keeping a close eye on retail. I want to challenge you on the retail economic evidence base. I think it's the term's been used in a few days since a retail strategy has been published, that everybody has the impression that traditional retailing is doomed because of the internet. And I'd like to assure everybody that is not the case. And you cannot base any assumptions about what's happened in the last year as evidence. We have to see what we look like as we come out of it. In fact, in my own case, we've actually seen a 10% growth in sales as customers have been really dedicated and kind, and we've been putting a lot of effort into attracting you into town. So I'll try and be brief, but it's very difficult for me. But let's talk about evidence base. Let's get behind the new retail strategy, and let's share information and have an objective discussion, because there will be conspiracy theorists who think, well, they're shutting down the north of town and it doesn't matter, and really that should be an island-wide facility. Thanks, Kevin.
Okay, I can see Ian has got his hand raised. So did you want to come in, Ian?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And first of all, just to say thanks to David for his kind words. I get the feeling I might need to check in after 6 months and see if he still feels the same way about me then. But I've just got one question about the core retail area, and I'm wondering whether or not for some of the other attendees today, it might be interesting to discuss how you might see the core retail area policies dealing with an application for something that's perhaps blurring the lines of what constitutes retail a little. And an example I'd give that some folk may have seen the programme, I think it was on ITV a couple of 2-3 weeks ago, that discussed, I think the complex was Gravity UK, or one example of a Gravity UK premises where the offer, or a new offer on a particular site, was going to be a mix of retail and entertainment. I think the variations were go-karts, trampolines, general family fun. And whilst I wouldn't suggest for a moment that Jersey's necessarily got the economies of scale to perhaps attract some complex like that on our high street, King or Queen Street, I wondered whether or not you've got any thoughts on whether or not a smaller scale variant of that might be entertained on the high street under these policies as they're currently drafted. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the as I said, the thrust of this is around protecting retail in the I suppose in the true sense of the word, so that would be the sort of primary thrust for the core retail area. However, recognising that this is about seeking to ensure vitality and viability. If there are premises that are, for whatever reason, no longer required or can no longer be sort of marketed for retail use, and some sort of entertainment, leisure activity was brought forward as a proposal, then I think that would sit reasonably well with the thrust of policy. So I think it's about looking at the town centre as a whole and looking at those activities that give people a reason to come to St Helier, and that's whether buying one of David's fresh croissants or coming in for some recreation and leisure activity. So I think those are the sort of policy objectives, if you like. What we need to test through the draft plan consultation process is, whether stakeholders think that the plan is doing that appropriately. Okay, so perhaps that's retail. We can obviously return to that, but we'll move on if that's okay. I'll look to cover office accommodation. So in terms of office accommodation, essentially a focus on provision of office accommodation within the existing built-up area, specifically a focus on larger scale office accommodation defined as anything above 200 square metres, encouraged in and around the waterfront, around the IFC. Smaller scale office supported within that wider town centre, St Helier town centre area, and also the defined area of Le Kennevet. So that's a change to current policy provision compared with the current plan. That explicit acknowledgement of Le Kennevet's role in having a wider range of potentially economic activity up there. In terms of outside of the built-up area, office use only supported where it's ancillary to existing use, and you can see there's evidence of a demonstrable need. No proposal to extend the market testing for change of use away from office accommodation. So that was office, fairly short and sweet, but related to that, I think Moz raised this issue around businesses run from home. Obviously, this has become more of a thing during the pandemic, and from a planning point of view, where a residence primarily remains as a residence, but somebody's working from a whatever it is, spare bedroom or a shed or whatever. That doesn't sort of challenge the planning system at all, and so that will remain to be permitted and encouraged without the need for any express consent. It's only when changes start to become probably more noticeable in terms of either trip generation to the property or generating noise or disturbance with deliveries or anything, that a change of use might be required, and the plan then would seek to subject any proposal like that to some tests, really just to look at the impact on neighbouring residential properties where that's relevant. So So in terms of responding to this this incidence of working from home, to some extent the existing plan provision deals with that, and that's carried through into the new plan. The next section deals with visitor accommodation. So the work that we've commissioned talks to the sort of changing nature of the visitor economy in the island, and the aspirations to extend the season, and also to look at sort of niche tourism. Obviously, there's been long-term structural change to Jersey's tourism offer, and that's continuing to evolve. We see the growth of sort of tourism activity and tourism visits focused around particular themes, whether that's some sort of heritage break or visitor activity associated with the island's sort of natural environment, and the aspiration is to attract a different type of tourist to the island. So the plan seeks to respond to that by looking to facilitate provision of different types of visitor accommodation where that might emerge. So that, again, the focus is still on meeting that provision within the built-up areas, particularly those tourist destination areas that I talked about earlier. But the plan explicitly acknowledges that there may be a requirement to provide a greater range of particularly self-catering accommodation, and the plan gives explicit recognition of that outside of the built-up area. But again, it's still subject to reasonably tight tests around seeking to make use of existing buildings in the around the coast and in the countryside, involving conversion of existing buildings, whether that be farm buildings or listed buildings. The plan also makes explicit recognition for things like campsites or use of land for touring units, and again, that's subject to tests around impact on visual amenity and capacity of local infrastructure. Again, with a sort of tight control over any new built development that might be associated with that. As you'll see here, there's no test for change of use away from visitor accommodation. So the current E1 policy has not been expanded in this in the draft plan. So the policy regime remains as currently drafted. There's one proposal in the plan which has got some resonance with one of the tourism destination areas, and that's St Brelade's Bay. The plan proposes the undertaking of an improvement plan to look at how the public realm in particular can be improved to ensure that St Brelade's Bay still operates as a prime destination for visitors to the island. I can see a number of questions, so I'll pause for those before we move on. So I can see Moz, you've got your hand up, and Alex, I think. So if we take Moz first.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, two things. I think I've raised separately with the Minister. It's that conflict between saying that you're going to support new visitor accommodation in an area like St Brelade's Bay, whilst at the same time having no tests for change of use from visitor accommodation. So I'm kind of wondering how you explain that this is an actual planning kind of device.
Well, clearly that would support if there are, well, obviously existing operators in St Brelade's Bay, tourism operators in St Brelade's Bay. So the plan would support proposals to improve and enhance those existing visitor accommodation facilities down there.
It says newer visitor accommodation, though. It's not saying about expansion of existing visitor accommodation. So
yeah, this is a summary of the plan. So I'd encourage you to read the plan. Yeah, it talks about enhancement of existing as well. we can continue to support investment in the island's tourism product, particularly around existing visitor accommodation and the associated facilities, those daytime and evening economy uses, and again, particularly in those tourist destination areas. If we get proposals for new visitor accommodation in those locations, again, they would be, the principle of them is supported. Obviously, it depends on the form, scale and nature of them in terms of their acceptability, but the plan's seeking to set out a support for the island's tourism economy and the changing nature of it, so that the industry can continue to invest in enhancing the offer.
What's the reasoning for no test for the change of use from visitor accommodation, given that the original argument was to do with financing?
Well, I think the arguments will be the same as they've always been. We've sought to explore the potential for providing a market test on visitor accommodation. That's always been resisted by the industry. The industry have always been of the view that they're best able to respond to the changing nature of the market, where they are not subject to a market test, and to subject them to a market test frustrates their ability to borrow and invest.
Is that industry as represented by the Jersey Hospitality Association, or the industry as represented by the actual collective of those hotels in the bay themselves?
Well, we've had representation from various sources, both collective bodies, individual agencies, and indeed, at a political level in terms of those ministers responsible for that area of policy.
Okay, I won't keep your time. It's just not clear in terms of the response to the survey regarding St Bernard's Bay. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's take Alex next, I think.
Thanks, Kevin. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Great. Don't worry, Moz. I'm actually going to pick up on this one now. Really, yeah, Kevin, I think what I see as a big change here is we've lost E1, and each policy has absorbed its own conversation around the test of employment land. And I guess my question and in turn my concern is we're not necessarily seeing further protections which we need. So, I appreciate you said we want to invest in our tourism economy. But at the same time, if a new entrant wishes to purchase a site to run, as you say, to restore, or even to demolish and rebuild for better use, for the changing tourism economy, they will have resistance against that because we don't have a test. And again, actually, I was waiting because I don't want to jump in again, but it was around the office accommodation. We again see the repetition of what we had in the case of E1, which is this exemption. And I'm really not understanding why we're not doing tests on these. There are genuine cases where you may say there is an office accommodation block ripe for conversion, ripe for residential use because it is in a neighbouring amenity space of residential. Yet at the same time, we might see office accommodation in Hill Street, for example, which we are seeing at the moment. And we're saying, well, there's no test for conversion. Yet this is prime for legal offices or the likewise. So, yeah, my question would be, why aren't we testing? And I appreciate you said that the industry is saying they don't want to test. If I sat on a large land asset and I had the potential for uplift by neglecting it or deciding to bow out, of course I wouldn't want to test. So I'd say, why does the industry get that say?
Well, I'm just, reflecting the basis on for the policy coming forward in the shape that it has. By all means, make those arguments and look at the employment land study, look at the evidence base that's been gathered around that. And in terms of the, as you say, the policy direction is that the E1 as an overarching policy has been unpacked and then applied sectorally to different parts of the island's economy. And as is currently the case, both office accommodation and visitor accommodation remain exempt from those tests. Interestingly, we have seen over the current plan period in terms of investment in visitor accommodation. We have seen movement in both directions. So you'll clearly be aware that a number of former hotel sites have come out of use. That tends to be around the lower grade visitor accommodation, where we see redevelopment to residential use in particularly in St Helier, but also in other sites around the island. But we've also seen investment in the industry as well. So upgrades to existing facilities, and also the growth of new products. So with the likes of Premier Inn arriving in the island during the current plan period. So it does work in both directions under the current policy regime. Similarly with office, we've seen a consolidation of sort of move to consolidate office functions, particularly amongst the island's finance and legal sectors, into larger floor plates and a higher grade office accommodation. That's freed up some secondary office accommodation, some of which has been refurbished and put to continued office use. And I mentioned the digital sector. That's obviously happened in places like Grenville Street, and we've seen reinvestment in other parts of the secondary office market as well. But again, some of that has come out of use and either conversion to residential or redevelopment. So there is movement in both ways.
Yeah, and I think I guess my question still remains, which is also, as you said, the policies are based on having a preamble of justification, and nowhere in the justification do I see why we would not safeguard and sense check any move with kind of rationale at sight. So we had if we think about ERE1 at the moment, safeguarding, and that's something that's missing in both these policies. As you said, it can move either way. It's preventing abuse, which seems to be ripe for repetition again.
Okay. Well, a valid point. This is opportunity to make those views known. Okay, Steph, I can see you've got your hand up. Is that new?
Yes, thank you, Kevin. It's a simple question, but possibly not an easy answer. My perception, based on the experience I have and doing what I do, that the built-up area is pretty full. And I understand the strategic approach to directing new development to the built-up area, but are we confident that there's enough room? That's kind of my question in a nutshell.
Okay. Well, I suppose I'd raise 2 points there. First of all, the plan is trying to come up with a sustainable form of development in the island, and trying to make use of existing already developed land, and seeking to ensure that land is used efficiently and effectively. So we see that in the residential sector, and that should be also encouraged in the commercial sector as well. And I suppose the second point to raise is that this is a short-term bridging island plan, so it's got a 3-year plan period. Part of the bridging plan period will be to monitor levels of demand across various sectors of the economy, and then there's opportunity to respond to that with any subsequent island plan review. And again, I've made reference to some of the work that we'll be undertaking to look at the west of the island, for example, and look at potential for economic development opportunity there. And we'll touch a little bit on that when we get on to the light industrial sector.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'll move on. I will move on to that industrial area now. As the current plan does, we define a series of industrial sites and premises across the island. We seek to protect those existing industrial sites, but also seek to protect units of accommodation or industrial units that are in use elsewhere in the island. So any change of use away from those from light industrial will be subject to a test. Outside of the built-up area, where we get proposals to reuse, particularly agricultural sheds, there's a policy regime that we'll touch on when we look at the rural economy. In terms of future demand for light industrial use, there are some potential opportunities, particularly around places like the Colette and some of the land which might be released as part of some of the master planning work that is being undertaken by Ports of Jersey. So looking both at the airport and at the harbour, which may have potential to accommodate these sorts of uses. And again, we'll touch on the use of agricultural premises when we look at the rural economy. Again, just to highlight a couple of strategic proposals, I've talked about the West of Ireland planning framework. There's also a proposal in the plan to develop an infrastructure roadmap for the island for the first time, looking collectively at what our infrastructure requirements are. One of the reasons for mentioning this in the context of this presentation is around the future role of La Colette and the opportunities that might present. So that's a piece of work that we propose to undertake to inform the next Island Plan review. Sorry, Alex, is that a new question? Or is your hand up from last time? No, okay. So, like I say, I'm conscious of time, so I'll move on to the second section of the economy area, which is really sort of mostly focused around rural economy. Picks up some also some marine economy elements. So first of all, protection of agricultural land. So the plan seeks to effectively continue the policy direction in terms of safeguarding agricultural land, but it does provide for some greater flexibility. So really seeking to protect high quality agricultural land, but allowing the potential for flexibility of use of agricultural land that's of a perhaps of a lesser quality or of lesser value to the agricultural industry. So a series of tests to enable us to establish that, working with colleagues in respect of planning applications that affect agricultural land. General support in the plan for rural diversification. So recognising that other activities other than agriculture take place in the outside of the built-up area, and the plan makes provision for that, subject to a number of tests. So again, looking at whether it's necessary and appropriate to a rural location. Is it supporting an existing business or is it a new business? And how does it land physically? Does it make use of existing buildings? What's its impact on context and site? Some specific provisions around farm shops, and all subject to the need for supporting information around some business justification, so a business plan to support proposals. Next couple of slides just deal with conversions of existing buildings. So firstly, traditional farm buildings. We've sought to define more closely what this means. So we're using a marker of anything that's pre-1960 and using that as a measure to look at whether or not it's appropriate to be subject to this policy. So we would seek to ensure that it's redundant to agriculture, and then subject it to some tests. Principally encourage an employment use, but potentially allowing non-employment uses where an employment use is not viable or appropriate. That needs to be supported by information around redundancy, but also about the capability of the building to be converted without major additions or structural change. And we will provide some supplementary guidance to support that. Reuse of modern farm buildings. This applies to structures built after 1960. Again, tests around redundancy and whether the new use is appropriate to its location. And this will need to consider issues like capacity of local road infrastructure, for example, and impact on any adjacent properties. We've added an additional test in here around, first of all, buildings being of a permanent design, and also in use for 20 years or more for agriculture, really as a way of trying to protect the provision of these buildings. That obviously their initial justification is to support the agricultural industry, and so this is seeks to secure their strategic availability for agriculture. We've also sought to recognise that there are a range of temporary buildings that are put up in the countryside, and the policy here allows for the reuse of those buildings, but only as long as they relative to the sort of serviceable life of those structures. So some change in the sort of nuances of the reuse of modern farm buildings. Again, support to extend or new buildings in the countryside, but again subject to tests around what's the requirement for them. How can that be demonstrated that there aren't other buildings that you can use for that purpose? And again, just looking at its impact on locality and the site itself. Glass houses, again, this is similar to the existing policy provision. Most of the glass houses that are sort of well related to the island's built up area and may have some potential for redevelopment for other uses such as residential have been taken. There are glasshouse stock that still remains, however, and this policy provision seeks to secure the effective removal of derelict and redundant glasshouses. So essentially, glasshouses should be removed where they're redundant. In exceptional circumstances, we may consider proposals to allow some development to affect their clearance, but that amount of development needs to be proportionate to the cost of removal and restoration, and there are some tests around that. And then lastly, on the sort of rural economy side, we've got a specific policy provision for equine development. So seeking to recognise that this is a thing in the rural economy, both at a commercial scale and at a private scale. And there's a policy framework to test proposals for equine development in the countryside. And then lastly, we just move on to fishing and aquaculture. So the plan provides explicit support for this element of the island's economy, support for provision of landside facilities, and that'll be treated in the same way as agricultural assessments, with a presumption in favour of development within the operational port, and as I say, outside of the built-up area, be treated in a similar way to proposals for farms. And then lastly, recognising the role of the aquaculture industry, working with colleagues in marine resources, develop this policy regime that seeks to focus and direct aquaculture proposals to what's called the Bay of Grouville aquaculture box. So a defined area that's sitting in the Royal Bay of Grouville, where there's capacity there for additional entrance or enhancement of the existing operations. for aquaculture, and that area is safeguarded for that use. So that was it. Apologies, it's quite a broad area of the plan, and that was quite a rapid canter through it. But hopefully, it's given you some signposting to the key policy areas that you may be interested in. We've got a couple of minutes for questions before we just cover off about the future engagement. So we'll perhaps take a couple of questions during the 5 minutes or so we've got before we wrap up. So I can see Moz and David. So Moz, do you want to go first?
Thanks, Kevin. Just a quick question about the aquaculture. Remember that Save Our Shoreline did suggest that having oyster farms in Snowman's Bay could actually help with things like the sea lettuce problem. So was this considered in terms of this designation? Was it rejected, or was it just not considered?
Well, as I say, we engage with our colleagues in marine resources who know more about aquaculture than we do, and they're seeking to consolidate the industry in that location in Grouville, and they are of a view that there's capacity there for any likely growth over the plan period. I know there's work being undertaken to look at how the sea lettuce issue in the bay might be dealt with, whether that involves any aquaculture in the bay. I suppose we could respond to that if new evidence emerged that might help resolve the problem.
Okay, thanks.
David, I can see your hand.
Thanks, Kevin. Slightly off piste and perhaps out of control, but nevertheless, I think it sort of crosses into the economy, the retail economy. We proposed a separate proposal to extend the closure of Broad Street in front of the States next week. I was wondering what sequential testing and economic impact assessment can be applied at this stage to know whether the project's of benefit or not. Although I'd like to, if I could make the opinion that it's not ideal to have that coming along as an individual project, and it should all be wrapped up within the island plan and the sustainable transport policy. So what are your views on somebody going off piste slightly, and how can we measure the impact? What tools do we have?
Well, in terms of, perhaps dealing with the context for it, when we deal with the thematic webinar on travel and transport, we'll pick up on issues associated with the plan for town, and particularly the public realm and movement strategy for St Helier, which talks about some of the objectives for management and use of the public realm and road space in St Helier. In terms of managing the impacts of a specific change, clearly that they are difficult to judge, and there are obviously opportunities to trial these things. Obviously, Broad Street's been subject to some sort of trial with partial closure, but perhaps not accompanied by any sort of delivery of any physical change or benefit to the street along with that. So perhaps a difficult one to judge specifically at this stage. Okay. Is that another? Have you got another question, Moz, or is it just your hand from earlier on?
I'm sorry, I left it up by accident.
That's okay. Okay. Well, I'm conscious that we're coming to the end of the session, so just before we wrap up, we just really wanted to reiterate the opportunities to continue to engage in the process. So you'll have seen on the website there's a series of these themed webinars, so more of those over the next couple of weeks around key topics. please come along to a parish session if you want to talk to us in person. There's also opportunity to book a surgery session if there's something that you want to talk about in detail, and we will send through a link to enable you to do that. So that will give you a link to our diaries, and you can book a slot through that. So that'll be a virtual session online on a Friday to follow the thematic webinars. So that operates for this week and then runs over the subsequent Fridays. And as I say, a consultation portal is live. We would encourage you to use that if you're wanting to make formal comments. So that was it. So thank you for your attendance today. As we said at the outset, this will be recorded, so the recording will be posted up online, and we look forward to either seeing you at one of these or one of our other events. So thanks very much for your attendance. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.